Please support this channel by subscribing. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep creating stories like this. The Vampire King returns to palace that feels wrong, too quiet, too clean, too empty. Then he hears something impossible. Children laughing inside his royal halls. When he opens the ballroom doors, he sees a human maid holding 4 tiny heirs, and the way they look at him makes his blood turn cold. The Vampire King returned without warning, stepping out of cold shadow into a palace that should have knelt before him, yet did not. And the first thing he felt was not triumph or rage, but an unsettling wrongness. A silence too clean, too practiced, as if the halls were holding their breath. The chandeliers burned low, the guards were gone, and dust floated where court life should have stirred, making his ancient instincts tighten with suspicion as he moved forward. Every step measured, ready for betrayal, ready for blood. He had crossed the shadow war believing he might never come back, believing enemies would tear his throne apart in his absence. But nothing had prepared him for the sound that reached him then, light and bright and utterly impossible. Children laughing. Inside a vampire palace. He froze, heart turning cold as memory and law collided in his mind, because vampire heirs were legends whispered once in centuries. And yet the laughter echoed again, soft and alive, pulling him down familiar corridors toward the grand ballroom. When he pushed open the doors, the world cracked. In the center of the marble floor stood a human maid, her uniform slightly torn, her hair loose from pins, laughing as she held a thick rope, while 4 toddlers clung to it with delighted strength. 2 girls pressed against her waist, and 2 boys tugging from the other end, all dressed in mismatched finery, all glowing faintly red in the eyes. The king could not breathe. He recognized the maid only vaguely, quiet and invisible, the kind of servant the court forgot. Yet here she was, fearless and radiant, guarding what should not exist. When she turned and saw him, color drained from her face, laughter died in her throat, and the rope slipped from her hands as the children tumbled back, giggling unharmed, sensing the shift in the air like a coming storm. The king found his voice at last, rough and low, asking what they were, and the maid stepped forward without thinking, placing her body between him and the children, trembling yet unyielding, her courage sharp enough to cut through fear. She told him the truth in a whisper that shook the room. They were his quadruplets. The words struck him like a blade, and as he stared at the 4 small faces curious, bright, undeniably, he felt the blood bond awaken, a deep, undeniable pull that confirmed the impossible. One of the girls tugged at the maid's skirt and asked who he was, calling the maid Mama, and the king's chest tightened with a pain he did not know how to name. He demanded answers, and the maid spoke quickly, confessing that the children were conceived the night before he left for war, that she had discovered the pregnancy too late, that she had hidden them to save their lives from nobles who would kill a human and seize royal heirs to control the throne. As she led him to a hidden nursery in the palace's oldest wing, he saw proof of her quiet war iron bars, carved sigils, simple weapons, and scars on her arms earned protecting children who should have been guarded by an army. Rage and guilt burned together inside him as she admitted there had been attempts on their lives. Poison, fire, assassins, all stopped by her alone. Before he could speak, one of the boys toddled forward and grabbed his cloak, unafraid, and another child lit a candle with a careless touch, while a girl bent shadows into playful shapes, revealing power far beyond their age. The king realized then that these were not ordinary heirs, but something ancient, something dangerous, something the court would kill to possess. As the maid gathered the children close, eyes shining with fear and resolve, distant whispers stirred beyond the nursery walls, and the king understood the truth too late. His return had awakened enemies who would not wait, and somewhere in the palace, the hunt had already begun. The Vampire King stood in the narrow nursery doorway, surrounded by soft blankets and crude protections. trying to reconcile the fragile warmth of sleeping children with the cold weight of his crown, while the maid moved quietly around the room, checking locks and sigils with the tired precision of someone who had done this every night for nearly a year. He demanded to know everything, and this time she did not rush, speaking slowly as if each word carried the risk of death, explaining how the palace had changed after he vanished, how nobles smiled too much and servants disappeared, how whispers of succession began long before anyone declared him lost. She told him how the children were born too early, how healers refused to help when they learned the truth, how she held 4 tiny bodies through nights she believed would be their last, praying to gods she was no longer sure listened to humans. The king listened in silence, his anger building not toward her, but toward the court that had failed him so completely. And when he asked why she had not fled the city, her answer struck deeper than accusation, because she said running would have made them hunted, but hiding in plain sight inside the palace made them invisible, underestimated, forgotten, just like her. As if to prove her point, the children stirred, and one of the girls reached toward the shadows on the wall, twisting them into simple shapes, laughing as the darkness obeyed, while one of the boys touched a metal cup and bent it slowly with focused curiosity. The king felt his breath catch as raw power filled the room, uncontrolled and innocent, and he realized these children were more than heirs. They were living weapons waiting to be claimed. The maid lowered her voice and revealed the final truth, that she had found an old prophecy in the restricted archives while searching for answers, a forgotten text that spoke of 4 royal-born children rising together, their abilities awakening early, their existence capable of either saving the vampire realm or tearing it apart. She did not claim to understand it fully, only that nobles who knew of it would never allow the children to remain free. As if summoned by her words, distant footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, followed by hushed voices that fell silent. The moment the king's presence was sensed, and the maid stiffened, fear flashing across her face as she whispered that the council had been watching the servant's wing for weeks. The king felt a familiar pull of battle instinct, but this fight was different, because standing before him were not enemies, but lives he had unknowingly created, lives that reached for him without fear, trusting him without knowing his name. One of the boys grabbed his finger and smiled, and in that instant, the king felt something shift inside him, a resolve sharper than rage, heavier than duty, and more dangerous than mercy. He ordered the maid to stay close and commanded the shadows themselves to seal the corridor, knowing this protection would not last because the palace was already waking to his return. From a distant tower, unseen eyes watched the servant's wing through enchanted glass, confirming rumors that should never have been true, and a calm voice spoke of opportunity while another spoke of control. Back in the nursery, the king knelt before the children and promised, not aloud but with every ounce of his power, that no one would take them. Yet even as he made that vow, the palace bells began to ring, calling an emergency council, and the king understood with chilling clarity that the moment he stepped into that chamber, the fate of his children, the maid, and his throne would be decided by those who had been waiting for him to return. The council chamber no longer felt like a place of order when the vampire king entered, because the air was thick with ambition disguised as concern, and every noble face lifted toward him carried a smile that arrived a moment too late, as if rehearsed. He took his seat without ceremony, his presence forcing silence, yet he could feel the balance of power had shifted during his absence, and the nobles were no longer afraid in the way they once had been. They welcomed him back with soft words and careful praise, speaking of relief and loyalty, but their eyes kept drifting toward the servant's wing, toward secrets they were pretending not to know. It was Lord Darien who finally spoke what the others wanted said, calmly suggesting that disturbing rumors had reached the council. Rumors of irregular heirs conceived in secrecy, raised without oversight, posing a risk to the stability of the realm. The king answered simply that his children were not a subject for debate, and the temperature in the chamber dropped as frost crept along the obsidian table. Lady Selene leaned forward then, her voice smooth and sympathetic, insisting this was not punishment, but protection. That royal heirs belonged to the realm, not to sentiment, and that placing them with noble guardians would ensure their safety and proper education. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to take the children and erase the human who stood in the way. The king refused again, slower this time, warning that anyone who reached for his bloodline would answer to him. But the murmurs around the table told him the council had already decided something dangerous. Outside the chamber, the maid stood frozen behind a stone pillar, sent to deliver wine, but arriving just in time to hear her fate discussed as if she were not human, as if she were an inconvenience to be removed. She heard her name spoken with false pity, heard suggestions of relocation, confinement, quiet solutions. And she understood that the protection she had relied on for months was cracking now that the king had returned. That night, as the palace settled into uneasy silence, the maid returned to the nursery and reinforced every sigil with shaking hands, her movements fast and practiced, while the children slept unaware, small chests rising and falling in fragile peace. She did not hear the footsteps until it was almost too late. A blade flashed in the dark, and instinct took over where fear might have killed her. As she struck back with whatever she could reach, the sound of metal clashing against stone echoing briefly before silence fell again. By the time the king felt the ward shatter and arrived in a storm of shadows, the assassin was gone, and the maid was on her knees, bleeding but standing, one arm wrapped around a crying child while the others huddled behind her. Rage unlike anything he had known burned through him. Not the cold fury of war, but something sharper, more personal. And as he lifted the terrified children into his arms, he saw the truth clearly for the first time. This was not politics. This was a hunt. And the maid, underestimated and alone, had been the only thing standing between his bloodline and extinction. As palace alarms finally began to ring and guards flooded the halls far too late, the king turned toward the council wing, eyes glowing with lethal promise, knowing the attack was only the beginning, and that the next move would not come from the shadows, but from the very people who claimed to serve him. The palace did not sleep after the failed attack. It watched, listening through stone and magic, as the vampire king sealed the nursery with power older than the court itself. Shadows folding like living walls, while the maid cleaned her wound with steady hands that hid how close she had come to death. The king demanded to know how many times this had happened before, and she answered without drama, telling him there had been fires disguised as accidents, poisoned food meant for servants, and hired killers who thought a human woman would be easy prey. All of them stopped quietly, because noise would have brought the council faster than help. Her calm honesty cut deeper than anger, because it showed him the cost of his absence in scars and sleepless nights. And when he asked why she never asked for protection, she told him protection had always come with chains for people like her. He realized then that the court had survived by convincing the weak that silence was safety, and the strong that cruelty was order, and that his throne had been built on obedience rather than trust. As dawn approached, the king summoned only those guards he trusted absolutely and dismissed the rest, announcing that the children would be presented to the court when he decided, not before. A declaration that sent shockwaves through the palace and whispers racing through hidden passages. The maid listened as plans were made around her, strategies and contingencies spoken in the language of power, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but unbreakable as she told the king that the council would not stop because fear had already failed them, and that if he truly wanted the children safe, he would have to fight differently than before. She explained that nobles expected force, executions, displays of dominance, but what they feared most was exposure, the truth of their plots revealed before the realm. And the king felt a strange respect bloom as he realized she had been surviving politics without ever being taught its rules. He agreed to her plan, not because it was safe, but because it was honest and he swore an oath that bound his power to her protection, marking her as under his direct command, a symbol the court could not ignore. When the council reconvened that evening, the king arrived with calm authority, announcing that the attack on the nursery had been investigated and that he would hear accusations openly, and the chamber filled with tension as nobles denied involvement too quickly, their rehearsed innocence cracking under his steady gaze. He revealed fragments of evidence, not enough to condemn, but enough to unsettle alliances. And when Lady Selene suggested relocating the children immediately for their own safety, the maid stepped forward without permission, carrying one of the children in her arms. Gasps filled the chamber as she spoke plainly of the attacks, of the nights she spent barricading doors, of the scars earned protecting lives no one else would claim, and the court was forced to see her not as a servant, but as a witness. The king did not interrupt, and that silence was more frightening than rage, because it told everyone he was listening to a human over them. The nobles retreated behind careful words, but their fear was now visible, and as the council adjourned, the king knew lines had been drawn. That night, as he stood with the maid watching the children sleep, he admitted that the court would strike again, harder and sooner, and she answered that she would not run. Not now, not after everything, because the children deserved a future that was not built on hiding. Far above them, in a tower that still answered to the old order, a quiet meeting ended with a single decision spoken aloud, that if the king would not surrender the heirs, then the realm would be forced to choose a new ruler, and the vote would be decided in blood. The night before the council vote arrived heavy with tension, and the palace felt like a living creature waiting to strike as the vampire king walked its corridors with the maid beside him, both aware that every shadow could hide betrayal, yet neither willing to step back now that the truth had been spoken aloud. Whispers spread faster than guards could silence them. Rumors of a no-confidence motion, of nobles promising safety while sharpening knives, and of a prophecy that many had dismissed now rising like a threat they could not control. In the nursery, the children slept uneasily, their powers stirring with emotion, shadows flickering when they dreamed, light bending when they stirred, and the maid confessed that the more danger surrounded them, the stronger they became, as if fear itself was fuel. The king realized then that hiding would only make them more volatile, and that the council's plan to divide the children among noble houses was not about protection but control, a way to break their bond and weaken what made them extraordinary. When he asked the maid what she wanted, truly wanted, she did not ask for safety or reward, but for dignity, a future where the children could grow without being treated as weapons, and for the chance to stand openly instead of always in fear. And her quiet courage struck him harder than any threat. As dawn broke, Lady Selene made her move, presenting forged evidence of instability, claiming the king's return had unbalanced the realm, and demanding an emergency vote to place the children under temporary guardianship until the throne could be stabilized. The chamber filled with murmurs of agreement, and the king felt the weight of centuries pressing down, knowing that force would only confirm their fears, yet silence would surrender everything. In that moment, he did something no one expected. He stepped away from the throne and spoke not as a ruler but as a father, admitting his absence, admitting his failure to protect what mattered most, and declaring that the maid had done what his court never would. She had chosen life over power. He named her protector of the heirs before the entire council, binding her role by royal decree. And when nobles protested that a human had no right to such authority, he answered that loyalty was earned by action, not bloodline. The maid stood trembling yet unbroken, holding the children as eyes burned into her from every direction. And when one noble moved too quickly, the children's power flared in warning, cracking stone and bending light, forcing the chamber into stunned silence. Fear replaced ambition as the council realized the prophecy was real, and that the children were already beyond their control. Still, the vote was called, and as names were spoken, the count tightened to a dangerous balance. until Lord Darien rose with a smile too sharp to trust, accusing the maid of manipulation and treason, claiming the children were tools she used to control the king. Before guards could move, the maid spoke again, not in defense of herself, but of the realm, warning that a kingdom built on taking children from their mother would fall no matter who sat on the throne. Her words rippled through the chamber, reaching those who still remembered what honor meant, and the vote broke narrowly in the king's favor. But victory felt fragile, incomplete. That night, as the palace settled into uneasy calm, the king told the maid that winning the vote had only delayed the inevitable, because those who lost would not accept defeat. And she answered that delay was enough if it gave them time to prepare. As they stood together watching the children sleep, their hands brushed briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. And far beyond the palace walls, allies and enemies alike began to move. Because the realm now knew the heirs existed, and the final battle for the throne had begun. Asterisk, the final confrontation did not arrive with horns or armies, but with a quiet certainty that spread through the palace like dawn after a long, violent night, because those who plotted in shadows had already revealed themselves, and the vampire king was done playing their game. He summoned the full court at sunrise, not in armor, not surrounded by guards, but standing openly with the maid at his side and the 4 children before him, no longer hidden, no longer afraid. The nobles gathered in uneasy silence, expecting punishment, blood, or exile. But what they found instead was something far more unsettling, a ruler who refused to rule by fear alone. The king spoke calmly, laying bare every plot uncovered, every assassination attempt, every lie used to weaken the throne during his absence, naming names without raising his voice, letting truth do the damage cruelty once did. When Lord Darien attempted to interrupt, the king revealed the final proof, witnesses, records, and alliances exposed so completely that denial collapsed under its own weight, and Lady Seleni's carefully crafted smile finally cracked as guards stepped forward to restrain her. Not on the king's order, but on the council's, because fear had shifted sides. The maid watched it all with quiet disbelief, realizing that the court was not being conquered. It was being forced to remember what it was supposed to be. And when the king asked the council what kind of realm stole children from their mother to feel safe, no one answered. The children sensed the change too, their powers calming as tension eased, shadows resting, light settling, and for the first time, the palace felt alive rather than hostile. The king then did the unthinkable. He refused to execute his enemies publicly, declaring that exile and stripped titles were punishment enough, because a kingdom rebuilt on endless blood would never be stable, and justice without mercy was just another form of tyranny. Gasps echoed through the chamber, but none challenged him, because his authority no longer needed violence to stand. Turning to the maid, he knelt before her in full view of the court, not as a king lowering himself, but as a man acknowledging truth, and named her guardian of the heirs and voice of the vulnerable, granting her a place beside him, not as a servant elevated by favor, but as a protector proven by sacrifice. Tears filled her eyes as she tried to protest, but he silenced her gently, telling her that the realm needed to see what courage looked like when it wore no crown. When the children reached for him and her together, the moment sealed something deeper than law, a family formed not by conquest, but by choice. In the days that followed, the palace changed, guards were retrained, councils restructured, and policies rewritten to protect the weak instead of exploiting them. And the people noticed, whispers turning into loyalty, as stories spread of a human maid who stood against nobles and a king who listened. The maid slowly found confidence where fear once lived, no longer flinching at shadows, no longer hiding her voice, while the king softened in ways no war had managed, learning patience, learning presence, learning that power meant nothing without something worth protecting. On the night, the quadruplets took their first steps across the throne room, laughing as courtiers bowed not out of fear but respect. The king realized the prophecy had been misunderstood all along, because the children were not meant to save or destroy the realm by force, but to change it by reminding everyone why it existed in the first place. As he watched the maid smile freely for the first time, he understood the final truth, that the strongest crown was not forged from blood or shadow, but from trust, compassion, and the courage to choose humanity, even when power offered easier paths. And in that choice, the vampire kingdom finally found a future worth ruling.